From the moment you hear the word Frankenstein, I'm sure you already have a myriad of things come to mind. A lumbering green monster, a mad scientist and his hunchback assistant, or maybe an iconic scene or phrase.
It's alive!
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published in 1818, and from the very beginning, it made an impact on the literary world. Frankenstein is widely considered to be the first true science fiction story, at least in the modern sense of what we recognize as science fiction. Frankenstein explores ideas like the pursuit of science, the God complex, and the creation of artificial intelligence, which are familiar to anyone with a passing knowledge of sci-fi. But what might surprise you is that a majority of Frankenstein's iconic imagery doesn't come from the original novel. Frankenstein, or at least the Frankenstein of pop culture, is influenced directly by the 1931 film Frankenstein. Everything from the mad scientist archetype, the nature of the monster, and even the monster's appearance itself, all stem directly from the original 1931 film. And those aren't the only differences. In fact, the 1931 film and the original novel are so different, they might as well be considered distinct stories. And there's nothing inherently wrong with this either. Not every book can work as a one-to-one adaptation, and if the film version can match or surpass the original book, all the better. But because the 1931 film and the original book are so different, comparing the two is a severe case of apples and oranges. The 1931 film was one of the original monster movies, and it paved the way for horror and sci-fi films to flourish. But while the 1931 film is a classic monster movie, Shelley's original story is equal parts Gothic horror, science fiction, psychological drama, and religious allegory. Like most people, my original perception of Frankenstein came from the 1931 film, and I was surprised at just how different the book was. The original Frankenstein was a thought-provoking, yet deeply emotional kind of story, which isn't the impression you'd get from the classic film. But as amazing as the original story is, it's a story that's largely gone unnoticed by the general public. Frankenstein has been adapted into countless films, plays, and other works for over a century, but most of them draw from the 1931 film, which, to reiterate, is a very loose interpretation of the original book. There's been attempts to make a more faithful adaptation, like the 1994 film directed by Kenneth Branagh, but due to a combination of messy adaptations and the overwhelming influence of the 1931 film, the original Frankenstein story has fallen by the wayside over time. And make no mistake, the 1931 film is still great on its own merits. But the original story is renowned for a reason. Mary Shelley's original novel is a classic, and it's the kind of story that appeals to fans of anything from Gothic horror, science fiction, or romantic literature. And who knows, maybe by the end of this, your original perceptions of Frankenstein might change just as much as mine did. For the sake of simplicity, it's best to start with the most recognizable Frankenstein story, the 1931 film Frankenstein. While this film was meant to be an adaptation of the original book, calling it a book adaptation isn't technically accurate. This film was actually an adaptation of a stage play titled Frankenstein, An Adventure in the Macabre, written by Peggy Webling. Now, details on Webling's original play are quite scarce, but many plot points in the play were carried over into the film adaptation. For example, the stage play omits the Arctic expedition parts of the original story, and the creature's nature in the stage play is similar to the film's version. By all accounts, the stage play was reasonably successful, and it was successful enough to catch the attention of Universal Pictures. In 1930, Universal started production on an adaptation of the stage play, which led to the 1931 Frankenstein we know today. As for the film itself, it begins with Henry Frankenstein and his assistant Fritz. Henry is in the process of putting together a human body, with his eventual goal being to bring it to life. Henry believes he's discovered the secret behind life itself, and on the night of a raging storm, he attempts to put his theories and research into practice. Henry's experiment is a success, as almost immediately, the being exhibits signs of life. It takes some time for the being to gain consciousness, but when it awakens, it exhibits sluggish movement and limited intelligence. While it's not exactly friendly looking, there's nothing alarming about the creature at first, and Henry is able to guide it using very basic commands.
Go and sit down.
But the situation takes a turn for the worse when Fritz attacks the creature with a torch. The creature panics and lashes out, and the creature is then subdued and locked in a dungeon. But before Henry can decide the next course of action, Fritz enters the dungeon and continues to harass the creature. Shortly after that, it's revealed that the creature killed Fritz, and Henry decides the creature needs to be destroyed. The creature is then placed in the care of Dr. Waldman, who intends to destroy it via disassembly. Waldman promises Henry that the creature will be destroyed, and Henry leaves to go prepare for his wedding. But unbeknownst to Henry, the creature wakes up, kills Dr. Waldman, and escapes. But shortly after escaping the tower, the creature encounters a young girl named Maria. She isn't disturbed by the creature's appearance, and instead of running away, she offers to play a game with it. Maria and the creature proceed to throw flowers into a nearby lake, which the creature seems to enjoy. But once they run out of flowers, the creature picks up Maria and throws her into the lake instead. She doesn't resurface, and the creature then flees the scene. Meanwhile, at Henry's wedding, Henry is informed that Dr. Waldman has been killed, and shortly after that, the creature appears to his fiancée and frightens her, leaving her unconscious but alive. After the creature's appearance at Henry's wedding, Maria's father appears before the village, and he begs them for help in finding the monster that killed his daughter. The village is outraged and forms a mob, and both the mob and Henry set out to hunt down the creature. But as the mob continues their search, Henry is attacked by the creature and taken to a nearby windmill. Henry wakes up moments later, and after one final confrontation with his creation, Henry is thrown off the top of the windmill, while the villagers burn the windmill down along with the creature. But as the film comes to a close, it's revealed that Henry survived the encounter, while his creation itself is nowhere to be seen. From a more modern perspective, the 1931 Frankenstein probably doesn't look or sound very exciting. The story is fairly basic, and there isn't much in the way of crazy twists or turns. And if you compare this film to more modern ones, it's simply not as scary or thrilling as films that came decades later. But like with a lot of classic films, you have to keep in mind the time period in which it was made. Back in the 1930s, sci-fi and horror movies were in their infancy, so while the story seems basic now, it was anything but basic back then. And from the perspective of a heavily desensitized modern audience, of course it's not very frightening. But if you were watching this in the 1930s, there's a good chance this film might give you nightmares. And from a production standpoint, it's hard to find a lot of genuine faults with the film. The script and actors are solid, and the special effects were incredible for their time. The 1931 Frankenstein is just a solid film from beginning to end, and while it does still have its goofy moments, it still mostly holds up today. But as good as the 1931 film is, it's not the best representation of the original story. The story begins in the Arctic region, and the first character we meet isn't Frankenstein, but Captain Walton, an explorer bound for the North Pole. Walton's journey is interrupted when he finds a dying man in the ice, and the man is taken aboard and slowly nursed back to health. The stranger wakes up and reveals himself to be Victor Frankenstein, and after learning of Walton's expedition, he notices Walton is driven by the same curiosity and ambition that once drove him. Upon this realization, Victor explains that he wishes for Walton to hear his tale, in hopes that Walton might be able to learn from his mistakes. Walton agrees to listen, and Victor proceeds to explain his story from the beginning. The early chapters explore Victor's upbringing, which for all intents and purposes, is a very normal childhood. But at the age of 17, Victor experienced his first tragedy. His mother passed away from scarlet fever, but even though Victor was deeply affected, the world still turned. Shortly after his mother's death, Victor left for university, and almost immediately he dove headfirst into his studies. Victor spent the next few years learning about all manner of philosophy and science, and eventually he settled on a goal: to learn about the mystery behind life, through any means possible. But in order to research life, Victor realized he needed to examine death as well, since life and death are so intrinsically connected. After more research and observation, Victor unlocks the secret behind life, although the exact means of giving life are never specified. It isn't long until Victor expresses his desire to create a human being. As he explains, if he can give life to another being, in time, he might be able to give life to those who've already died. Then, after years of work, Victor is able to assemble his creation and bring it to life. But as soon as the being stirs, Victor is horrified at his creation. Victor designed the creature to be beautiful, but instead, it's hideous, with yellow skin, dark flowing hair, and watery eyes. Victor flees from his lab and his creation, and the next day, he runs into his childhood friend, Henry Clerval. Henry notices Victor isn't well, and the two visit Victor's lab. But Victor's creation is nowhere to be seen, and as soon as Henry asks Victor for an explanation, the question alone causes Victor to fall into a nervous fever. Victor spends the next few months being nursed back to health, and once his condition improves, he plans to return home for the first time in years. But shortly before Victor's trip, he receives a letter from his father. The letter explains how his younger brother, William Frankenstein, was strangled to death by an unknown assailant. Victor and Henry then set out for Geneva, and on the journey, Victor catches a glimpse of his creation in the shadows. Victor then suspects that his creation might have been what killed his brother, and he begins another emotional spiral. Victor makes it home safely, but upon his arrival, his father explains that the family housemaid, Justine Moritz, is believed to be his brother's killer. Victor knows that isn't true, but he also recognizes that he has no concrete proof of the creature's existence or involvement. Justine is later tried and then executed, and Victor blames himself for the entire incident. All of Victor's experiences haunt him for months, so much that he contemplates suicide on many occasions. He's able to find some solace in his lover Elizabeth, but his thoughts are often plagued with overwhelming guilt and grief. One evening, Victor retreats to the mountains to ease his thoughts, but when he reaches the summit, he comes face to face with his creation. Victor is overcome with fury, but the creature responds with words. The creature speaks to Victor in full, human speech. and at the very least, it urges Victor to hear what it has to say. Victor reluctantly agrees, and the creature proceeds to tell its story. The creature's story begins shortly after its creation. After Victor fled his lab, the creature wandered the wilderness until it found an abandoned hovel. The creature found refuge in the hovel, but it noticed that a small family lived nearby. The family consisted of an elderly blind father and his 2 adult children, and as the creature observed them, it learned how to speak by watching their conversations. Over time, the creature began to care for the family, and it wished to someday meet them face to face. But even though the creature longed to meet the family, it understood that its ghastly appearance would terrify them. Instead, the creature resolved to help them in small ways, like gathering firewood, in hopes that someday it may be worthy of their affection. One evening, the father is left alone, and the creature decides to reach out and attempt to befriend him. The father believes the creature to be a well-educated traveler, and the two bond before being interrupted by the blind man's son. The creature is attacked and driven out of the house, and the next day, the family has left the area out of fear. The creature is both outraged and saddened by how it's been treated, and it resolves to seek out Victor Frankenstein, the only person who could possibly understand its plight. The creature begins traveling to Geneva, but along the way, it finds a girl drowning in a nearby river. The creature rescues the girl, but is immediately attacked by bystanders, as they mistakenly believe the creature to be harming the girl. This event magnifies the intense emotions within the creature, and it eventually makes its way to Geneva. By sheer happenstance, the creature meets a young child, and it then comes up with an idea. If the creature were to abduct the child and educate them, the child may grow up free from prejudice. If the child grew to see the creature as its friend, then the creature would finally have a true companion. The creature attempts to explain this to the child, and naturally, the child tries to escape. The child exclaims that his father, Alphonse Frankenstein, will hear of this event and punish the creature. And upon hearing that this child is of the Frankenstein family, the creature is overcome with rage and strangles him. It isn't long until William's body is discovered by Justine, and the creature reveals it planted evidence of its murder on her, which led to her trial and execution. As the creature finishes its story, it asks Victor for one thing: a female companion just like it, so that it will never experience the agony of loneliness ever again. At first, Victor refuses, as he sees the creature as nothing more than an abomination. But the creature swears that if Victor keeps his promise, the creature and its companion will go to South America and leave Victor in peace. Victor then agrees to the creature's terms, and the creature leaves, promising to observe Victor from afar. Victor begins working on the creature's companion, but as time passes, he's plagued with fear and paranoia about his next creation. He's afraid of making a creature as terrifying as the last one, and the mere thought of this is enough to shake Victor to his core. So, instead of keeping his promise, Victor destroys the unfinished creation. Victor's actions enrage the creature, but instead of harming him, the creature leaves Victor with a cryptic warning: "I will be with you on your wedding night." The creature then departs, and sometime later, Victor is taken into custody for the murder of Henry Clerval. Henry's body showed that he was strangled to death, but even though his murder was suspicious, Victor is eventually found innocent and released. Following this, Victor travels back home, and he intends to marry Elizabeth in an attempt to salvage what little happiness remains in his life. Victor and Elizabeth are married shortly after, but Victor is left wondering if the creature intends to follow through on its threat. The next evening, Victor asks his wife to stay in her room while he searches the area, with the intent of killing the creature before it kills him. But moments later, he hears a scream, and he bolts to his wife's room to find her strangled to death. The creature then leaves again, and this prompts Victor to return home for his father's safety. Victor returns to find his father alive, but severely heartbroken over the loss of his loved ones. Alphonse Frankenstein dies only a few days after Victor's return, and over time, Victor's grief evolves into rage. Victor then resolves to hunt down his creation and destroy it, even if he dies doing so. Victor travels across Europe searching for the creature, but the creature always stays one step ahead. And to add insult to injury, the creature leaves clues, supplies, and taunting messages, all in an effort to mentally torment Victor. Their chase eventually makes its way to the Arctic region, which is where Victor crosses paths with Captain Walton. As Victor finishes his tale, he reiterates that he intends to hunt down the creature no matter what, even if he must do it alone, and even in his sickly condition. But Victor's condition fails to improve, and after one final conversation with Walton, Victor Frankenstein dies, and he leaves Walton with a final request: seek happiness and tranquility, and avoid ambition. Walton mourns for Victor as he sets off back to England, but later that night, he enters Victor's cabin to find the creature. But to Walton's great surprise, the creature is mourning for its creator. Walton questions the creature's intentions, but the creature explains it doesn't have any. The creature laments how its hatred and thirst for vengeance never soothed the agony within its soul, and its violent actions only made it realize how truly monstrous it's become. The creature only wanted the love and happiness that any human craved, but it was shunned and despised at every turn. And yet, it's aware that it chose this path, a path that destroyed countless lives and tore at the very fabric of its being. The creature explains to Walton that no hatred, misery, or agony can match the way it feels about itself, and it promises it will end its life soon. Then, the creature leaves the ship, and Walton watches in silence as the creature slowly vanishes into the darkness of the sea. From that less than brief summary, I'm sure you can already get an idea of how different the book is compared to the 1931 film. The film very roughly follows the early chapters of the book, but it starts to deviate shortly after the creature is brought to life. After that, the film uses a mixture of plot points from the book, plot points loosely inspired by the book, and original plot points altogether. For example, the book and film feature different versions of Frankenstein's wedding, while the entire sequence with the village mob is original to the film. And beyond the plot changes, there's a few more changes when it comes to the minor characters. Characters like Captain Walton, William Frankenstein, and Justine Moritz aren't present in the film, and the minor characters present in both the book and film are changed ever so slightly. For example, in the book, Henry Clerval is Victor's best friend and confidant, and he ends up being yet another innocent victim at the hands of the creature. But on the other hand, his movie counterpart, Victor Moritz, is honestly just a background fixture. He's basically just there so the other characters have someone to talk to. But while these changes vary from minor to major, the most relevant changes are with the central characters. There are some similarities, but for the most part, the Frankensteins and their creations are quite different, and those differences affect each work's central themes and ideas. When it comes to the Frankensteins, broadly speaking, they both share similar traits and go through similar arcs. Henry Frankenstein and Victor Frankenstein are driven by the flames of ambition, and just like Prometheus, the Frankensteins defied the natural order and were then punished for their blasphemous actions. In essence, both the book and film are cautionary tales on ambition, the relentless pursuit of science, and playing God.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should.
But that's about where the similarities end. While the broad arc of each Frankenstein is similar, each of their respective characters and journeys are quite distinct. For starters, Henry Frankenstein is a relatively simple character. He's a man drunk on the power of progress and discovery, and by the end of the film, he pays the price and almost gets killed by his own creation. But while Henry Frankenstein is a fairly simple character, Victor Frankenstein is a bit more complex. Victor Frankenstein is actually an example of something called the Byronic hero, a kind of character named after Lord Byron, a famous English poet who also happened to be friends with Mary Shelley. The Byronic hero's origins can actually be traced back as early as Shakespeare's days, but it wouldn't become known as the Byronic hero until the 1800s. Since the character archetype is centuries old, it's gone through numerous changes and adjustments. But even though the Byronic hero has evolved over time, there's a very strong chance you've already seen them elsewhere. Byronic heroes are characterized by a dark past, which manifests in a brooding, cynical, and withdrawn personality. But despite their melancholy, Byronic heroes are capable of deep affection, which manifests as they begin to open up. Some classic examples include Fitzwilliam Darcy, Edward Rochester, and Edmond Dantes. As for more modern examples, you have Bruce Wayne, Guts, Shiki Ryogi, the Uchiha Bros. You get the idea. To this day, it's an incredibly popular archetype, and Victor Frankenstein is just one more among many. Large portions of Frankenstein involve Victor drowning in despair and struggling with guilt and paranoia, with his only happiness being brief moments with his loved ones. But by the end of the book, Victor has lost everything he ever cared about, and he's consumed by rage and vengeance. There's definitely an element of tragedy to Victor's story, as he was loved by many, intellectually gifted, and slowly loses any sense of joy in his life bit by bit. But at the same time, it's hard to feel sympathy when Victor is partially responsible for his fate. Victor's two fatal flaws were his relentless ambition and his complete inability to keep his emotions in check. A vast majority of Victor's mistakes go back to how his emotions override any sense of better judgment, and those blind, impulsive decisions often lead to dire consequences. For example, when Victor is assembling the creature, there were moments where he recognized the horror of his endeavors. He mentions the absolutely gruesome state of his laboratory, and at times, the thought of what he's doing disturbs him. But instead of listening to his conscience, he pressed onward, driven by the thrill of scientific discovery. And once Victor succeeds in creating another being, almost immediately, he's overcome with fear and disgust. Instead of facing his creation as its maker, he abandoned it, leaving it without any sort of guidance whatsoever. In short, Victor Frankenstein spent so much time chasing a goal, but he had no idea what to do once he actually got there. He's a textbook example of someone who craved power, but didn't want or understand the responsibility that comes with it. Instead of accepting his responsibility, he ran from it, and that lack of accountability is one of the many factors that led to his personal tragedies. And even though Victor goes through many hardships, it's hard to feel sympathy when Victor himself is the root of the problem. But as unsympathetic as Victor can be, it wouldn't be fair to label him as completely unsympathetic. Ambition isn't inherently a negative quality, and it's not like humans are known for making rational, level-headed decisions, especially under intense pressure. Victor is guilty of letting his emotions get the best of him at the worst of times, which is something everyone can relate to. And even though Victor does share some of the blame, there's more than one reason why the story unfolded the way it did. Victor's story is like a series of chemical reactions, where one explosive event leads directly into another. Victor did abandon the creature, but the creature also murdered Victor's brother, which in turn sowed the seeds of distrust and paranoia within Victor. By the time Victor is asked to create another creature, he's terrified of history repeating itself. His paranoia and fear are equal parts rational and irrational, but in the end, the irrational side won out. Out of fear, Victor destroyed his unfinished creation, which angered the creature and led to more murders. In the end, Victor Frankenstein made many mistakes, some more understandable than others. But whenever he was faced with a fateful choice, he let passion dictate his actions. He abandoned his creation out of fear and disgust, broke his promise out of fear and paranoia, and pursued the creature out of hatred and revenge, a decision that would ultimately lead to his death. When you look at Henry Frankenstein compared to Victor, Henry actually comes off as a slightly more positive character. The key difference is that Henry attempts to nurture his creation, whereas Victor immediately runs away. Henry's only real mistake was not trying harder. After the creature kills Fritz, Henry leaves it in the care of Dr. Waldman, only for the creature to later kill Waldman and escape. But while Henry at least tries to take responsibility, it is admittedly a very weak attempt. It's really a testament to how flawed Victor is that someone like Henry can do the bare minimum and still come off as a slightly better person. But while the Frankensteins differ from one medium to another, the biggest differences lie with their creations. For starters, the film creature is notably different in appearance and has different traits compared to the book creature. The film creature possesses low intelligence, and while it does grow and learn throughout the film, it never comes quite close to basic human intelligence. And this matters when it comes to the creature's actions, because as heinous as its killings are, it honestly doesn't know any better. It hasn't developed any sense of right and wrong, it's merely acting and reacting based on its environment. The first killing happens because it's provoked, while Maria's death occurs due to a misunderstanding. Dr. Waldman's death is a little more dubious, but hey, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. The creature in the film isn't some gentle giant, but it's not a malevolent demon either. It's more like a force of nature, and while it can be harmless, it can also respond in unexpected and violent ways. But while the film creature is of low intelligence, the book version is actually our equal, if not our superior. In the span of 2 years, the creature learned how to speak, read, and develop a deep understanding of itself and the world around it. The creature is actually the most eloquent character in the entire story, and it often has many pages devoted to its complex thoughts and feelings. And because the creature is so intelligent, it makes for a very different experience compared to the 1931 film. For one, the book creature actually feels scary. Unlike the film version, the book creature is faster, stronger, and smarter than us. It could kill you in a direct encounter, but it doesn't need to. It could throttle you when you least expect it, it could torture you, or it could harm your loved ones. It could feasibly do anything it wants. And second, because the creature is our intellectual equal, it means it has more agency. It has goals, it knows the difference between good and evil, and it actively makes conscious choices. Most of the creature's later actions, like the murders of Henry and Elizabeth, were planned, deliberate attempts to harm the person it hated the most. But even though the creature's actions are unforgivable, it's easy to understand why it acted the way it did. It's a being that was shunned by its creator, despised by the outside world, and it never got a chance to experience the happiness that every human longs for. It's a product of the world around it, and had someone shown the creature an ounce of compassion, whether it be Victor or someone else, there's a chance things would have turned out very differently. While I refer to Victor as a Byronic hero, I consider the creature to be one as well. Just like its creator, the creature is moody, withdrawn, and capable of deep affection. Victor Frankenstein set out to create life, and not only did he succeed, he went above and beyond. He created a being that was deeply human, complete with the desires, emotions, and flaws of humanity itself.
I think you are the most human man I have ever known.
But the real tragedy of Frankenstein is that it didn't have to end in tragedy. A common reading of Frankenstein is that in the end, Victor was the real monster, and I don't entirely disagree. Between Victor and the creature is the more sympathetic character, and its actions are a lot more understandable than Victor's. But even though Victor made terrible choices, the creature made terrible choices as well. The creature had agency in the story, and it chose to murder innocent people. The creature even expresses how each murder made its heart ache, and yet it continued killing. Victor chose to abandon the creature, but the creature also chose to murder William Frankenstein and framed Justine for William's murder. And when Victor broke his promise to the creature chose to murder Henry and Elizabeth. So instead of declaring one being as the real monster, my own reading is this. Both Frankenstein and his creation are monsters, and monstrous actions are related to the creation of more monsters. The cycle of tragedy begins somewhere, and it's only going to continue until someone recognizes where they went wrong and makes an effort to rectify their mistakes. Victor might have started the cycle by abandoning his creation, but the creature continued the cycle through its violent actions. Victor Frankenstein never took responsibility for his actions, and his overwhelming fear, paranoia, and hatred led to his death. Meanwhile, the creature continued its murders, and by the end of the story, the burden of its sins was so great it wished to destroy itself. Frankenstein and the creature might not have been born monsters, but through a combination of their environment and their own decisions, they led to each other becoming monsters by the end of the story. But of course, that's just my own interpretation. The beauty of Frankenstein is that everyone has a unique interpretation, and there's honestly so many different readings of Frankenstein I haven't even begun to cover. If you're someone who hasn't read the original Frankenstein, I highly encourage you to give it a shot. While I did outline the major story beats, a summary can never do the story justice, and it can never articulate how atmospheric and romantic the book is. And when I say romantic, I mean the classical definition, where it refers to a heavy emphasis on emotion. Frankenstein is a very emotional and heartfelt book, which isn't the sort of thing you'd expect from a story steeped in Gothic horror and science fiction. The 1931 Frankenstein is a classic, and it was the perfect kind of film for its time period. But as iconic as the film is, it's also an adaptation of another adaptation, complete with a myriad of changes to the original story. But even though the 1931 Frankenstein remains a pop culture juggernaut, the original story still has a place. You can even see that in Frankenstein adaptations through the years. The 1931 film sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein, actually borrows many plot points and themes from the original story. The Bride of Frankenstein is absolutely sublime, and in many ways, it's even better than the 1931 film. Or if you want a more modern example, look no further than Penny Dreadful. The show does have its ups and downs, but the Frankenstein storyline is one of the best parts of the show. Penny Dreadful draws from many parts of the original story, and it has one of the most faithful interpretations of the creature yet. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a timeless classic, and even though the shadow of the 1931 film looms large, the original story's influence can be felt everywhere. In the ever-present age of sequels and reboots, Frankenstein doesn't need a remake or reimagining. It just needs a passionate, faithful adaptation of the original story. The odds of that happening are admittedly not very high, but who knows? With the right vision, talent, and production team, maybe someday Frankenstein will finally get the adaptation it deserves.